The boarding area buzzed with the usual noise of travelers shuffling in line, checking tickets, and tucking bags into overhead bins. Among them was Mr. James Carter, a calm and dignified black veteran who had served his country with pride and honor. With his boarding pass in hand for seat 3A first class, he smiled, ready for a peaceful flight home. But that peace shattered the moment he reached his row. Sitting in his assigned seat was a white passenger who refused to move, claiming he had already settled in. The flight attendant hesitated, whispers spread, eyes turned. And yet no one acted. Carter politely explained, showed his ticket, even tried to keep things calm. But the man remained firm, entitled, and dismissive. The crew seemed reluctant to confront the situation directly. Minutes dragged on. Then, with quiet confidence, Mr. Carter made a single phone call, just one. No shouting, no scene, just a quiet message to someone who clearly mattered. And what happened next left the entire plane stunned. Engines stopped. The gate was resecured, and suddenly, the situation shifted. Flight crew rushed down the aisle. The man in seat 3A began to look uncomfortable, then worried. Passengers leaned in, sensing something big was unfolding before them. Who was on the other end of that call? Why did it cause the flight to halt completely? And what hidden power did this humble veteran hold that brought an entire plane to a standstill? Stay with us because this is just the beginning. The passengers watched in silence as flight attendants moved with new urgency. One of them whispered into her radio, eyes occasionally flicking toward Mr. Carter. The man still sitting in seat 3A shifted uncomfortably, now gripping the armrest tighter. But Carter remained composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push. He just stood quietly in the aisle, his military ID still visible in his hand, along with the boarding pass that clearly showed 3A. It was a quiet kind of power, the kind earned through years of service, not noise. A few rows back, a couple who'd overheard the earlier exchange whispered, "Isn't that the retired colonel who testified before Congress?" Another passenger checked his phone, then glanced back toward Carter with wide eyes. There was more to this man than met the eye, and slowly people were beginning to realize it. The white passenger who had taken the seat still didn't move. He occasionally glanced toward the cockpit, as if hoping someone would defend him, but the mood on the plane was shifting. Tension thickened as a uniformed airline official suddenly boarded, walking briskly toward first class. He stopped directly in front of Mr. Carter and spoke in a low voice. No one could hear the words, but they saw the nod. Mr. Carter handed over a card, and the official's expression changed. Passengers leaned closer, eyes locked on the unfolding drama. No one knew what was coming next. But one thing was clear: this flight wasn't going anywhere just yet. The airline official stepped back and spoke quietly into his walkie-talkie. Within seconds, a supervisor joined him at the front of the cabin. Passengers now fully leaned into the moment, some pretending not to stare, others holding their phones just low enough to avoid suspicion, quietly recording what felt like history in motion. The man in 3A, once bold and dismissive, now sat stiffly, his jaw tight. He muttered something under his breath as the supervisor turned to him and asked for his boarding pass. Down the aisle, whispers grew louder. One flight attendant glanced at Mr. Carter with a mixture of concern and embarrassment. She'd seen what happened from the start but didn't speak up. Now, she was clearly second-guessing that decision. A few passengers exchanged looks, irritated that the flight was delayed, others clearly rooting for justice, whatever that meant in this moment. A woman in row 5 nudged her husband and said, "You remember that viral speech about military benefits last year? I think this is the same man." Back in the terminal, gate agents had started rechecking records, and a senior security officer appeared at the jet bridge entrance. This wasn't just a seating mistake anymore. Something deeper was unfolding, something that touched on race, power, and dignity. Mr. Carter's silence only deepened the mystery. Who was he really? Why did a single phone call bring the airline to a halt? And why, despite all eyes on him, did he still look like he wasn't surprised by any of it? The answers hadn't come yet, but the entire plane was waiting. The cabin felt frozen in time. The engines were off, and the once routine flight had now become a scene of growing tension. The man in 3A finally stood up, not out of apology, but to argue. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." He waved his ticket in the air, but the supervisor didn't flinch. Calmly, they took the ticket, examined it, and then looked at Mr. Carter's. Side by side, the truth was plain, but no words were spoken. The tension wasn't just about seating anymore. It was about what people were willing to ignore, and what they were finally being forced to confront. Outside the plane, the airport police had arrived at the gate, quietly briefed by the security team. A quiet hush fell across the terminal windows as curious onlookers began to notice. On board, a young man sitting across the aisle pulled out his phone and began searching Mr. Carter's name. A few taps later, his eyes widened. "Geisy," whispered, turning to the passengers behind him. "He's not just a vet. He's the guy who shut down that defense contractor for discrimination last year." Gasps followed. The dots were connecting. This wasn't just a man with a ticket, it was someone with a history of standing up when others wouldn't. Still, Carter hadn't raised his voice once. His calm, steady presence was now the loudest thing in the room. and just as the supervisor prepared to speak, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out slowly, scanning the scene. Whatever was about to happen next, everyone knew it would change the entire mood of the flight, and maybe far more than that. The captain's presence shifted the entire atmosphere. His eyes locked on Mr. Carter, then on the man who had refused to move. "Sir," he said firmly to the white passenger, "you'll need to come with me." But before the man could react, another voice rose from the back of first class. A woman, sharp-suited and assertive, stood up. "Captain," she said, holding up her ID, "I'm with the Department of Transportation. I was on this flight for an inspection. I've seen everything." The cabin went dead silent. Passengers looked at one another, stunned. A federal official had been quietly watching this entire time. Even the crew seemed caught off guard. The woman walked forward calmly, standing between the captain and Mr. Carter. "This isn't just a seating issue anymore," she said. "It's now a matter of federal interest. Passenger rights, discrimination, chain of command, all of it." The man in 3A turned pale. "This is absurd," he mumbled, but his confidence had vanished. He glanced around, suddenly realizing no one was on his side anymore. The flight crew now looked to the inspector for direction, not the captain. Mr. Carter still hadn't said a word. He stood there, composed, watching it all unfold. The card he had handed over earlier, it wasn't just any contact. It had set something larger in motion. A silent message, a quiet call to someone who clearly had reached far beyond a seat on a plane. Outside the window, a second police car pulled up. Inside, everyone held their breath. Something big was about to drop in. No one was ready for what came next. The captain stepped aside as the inspector took control. "Mr. Carter," she said respectfully, "please take your seat. You were rightfully assigned 3A." At that, the man who had been occupying it finally stepped out into the aisle, avoiding eye contact with everyone. But before he could walk off the plane, one of the officers entered and quietly handed the official a file. She flipped through it, then turned sharply toward him. "Turns out," she said, her voice steady but pointed, "you used a fraudulent upgrade pass. This isn't the first time you've done this either. There are 3 previous reports under your name." Murmurs spread through the cabin. It had started as a story about a stolen seat, but now it was something much bigger. The man didn't resist as the officers quietly escorted him down the aisle and off the plane. Past passengers who no longer hid their disbelief or judgment, Mr. Carter sat down at last, quiet as ever, and buckled in. The captain returned to the cockpit. The engines restarted. But just as the door was about to close, the inspector approached Carter one more time and said, "Thank you for handling this with such grace. Washington sends its regards." Passengers looked at one another, stunned. Washington? Just who had he called? As the plane taxied down the runway, someone in economy finally asked aloud what everyone was thinking. Was that ... the James Carter, who once advised the president on Veterans Affairs? Mr. Carter looked out the window. He didn't answer, but the smile on his face said enough. As the plane lifted into the sky, calm finally settled over the cabin. The earlier tension was gone, replaced with a quiet sense of respect. Some passengers looked back at Mr. Carter with new understanding, not just as a black veteran, or a man whose seat was stolen, but as someone who stood tall without raising his voice. A flight attendant gently leaned over and offered him a warm drink on the house. "Thank you for your service," she said softly. Word of the incident would spread beyond that flight. By the time they landed, a few videos had already begun making their way across social media. People talked about the stolen seat, the fake upgrade pass, and the quiet dignity of the man who never needed to show.